In 1827, the composer Hector Berlioz went to see an English company performing Hamlet in Paris. He'd never seen a Shakespeare play before, and in fact he spoke no English. But that evening he fell in love with the play, and with the author, and indeed with the actress playing Ophelia, Harriet Smithson. Shakespeare, coming upon me unawares, struck me like a thunderbolt. I saw, I understood, I felt that I was alive and that I must arise and walk. Well, I don't have much in common with Berlioz, but Shakespeare crept up from behind and hit me like a hammer when I was 11 years old. I spoke English all right, but I had no more natural affinity with the world of Shakespeare than might any other Tottenham Hotspur supporter of that age. And the occasion was a visit to the Old Vic Theatre in London to see a production of Macbeth. And believe you me, it wasn't my idea to go. And in fact, my parents, who took me, were only thinking in the vaguest and most general way that perhaps it would be good for the boy to see a Shakespeare play as part of his general education. Well, little did they know. The show started with a blood-curdling scream that came slicing out of the darkness, which then lifted to reveal a soldier covered in blood stumbling onto the stage and collapsing dead. And a few moments after that, from behind a mass of dead trees and twisted branches behind him, the figures of the three weird sisters rose to begin the show. Well, by that time, I was on the edge of my seat. And that play being what it is, I stayed there all night. Macbeth, fine actor, Paul Rogers, saw his imaginary airborne dagger and followed it slowly towards King Duncan's bedroom in order to commit the murder. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear the very stones prate of my whereabouts, and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. And though I knew perfectly well even then that I was looking at an actor in a pair of property boots moving across a painted stage floor rather like this one, what I was really hearing was the soft sound of his leather soles on the flagstones of Glamis Castle. And I felt that I could imagine the silence and the cold and the darkness swirling about its battlements. A few moments later, as the deed was being done, Anne Todd, as Lady Macbeth, thought that she heard an untoward sound. Hark! Peace. It was the owl that shrieked, the fatal bellman that gives the sternest good night. And this time what caught my attention was a kind of jagged contrast in the language between the shriek of the owl and the solemnity of the fatal bellman that gives the sternest good night, as if someone had jammed the phrases up against each other with some wild swoop on the saxophone. A little later in the evening, Lady Macbeth walked in her sleep and finally breathed her last, at which point Macbeth looked out on us as if through one of the doorways of hell. I have lived long enough. My way of life is fallen into the seer, the yellow leaf. Now, I didn't know what the seer was, but it had a kind of tearing sound to it, like something that couldn't be mended. But I sure enough knew what the yellow leaves were, because only a few hours previously, and already felt like a lifetime, I'd been trudging home unwillingly from school for once, knowing that I had to go and see this damn Shakespeare play that evening. And it was a particularly nasty autumn evening, and I remember noticing how the leaves from the plane trees on our street had blocked up the gutters under yellow street lamps that made the pavement look yellow too. So this time it wasn't the grandness of Shakespeare's language at all which caught my attention, but its near-at-handness, its familiarity, this yellow leaf. With the result that though I was only 11, and I'd certainly not committed any murders, I sort of knew what the aging Macbeth felt about his life falling like autumn leaves. Well, back home again and safe, I was like a child possessed. And my parents must have wondered if they'd ever hear comforting talk of Tottenham Hotspur again. I grabbed a copy of Macbeth off the shelf and started reading it out loud, and for days, weeks, months to come, I kept reading Shakespeare out loud. And in fact, for years, really, because I still can't read him in silence. And I realized what I was doing, which was trying to find out whether this extraordinary new sound that I'd heard, which was at once so grand but also so intimate and familiar, would in any way work coming off my tongue as well. And you know, it sort of did. So there was a first lesson learned, that in that sense it belonged to me in my piping childish treble going on adolescent baritone, just as it did to the experts. And so now here I am, an expert of sorts myself, having spent at a recent rough estimate about 20,000 hours of my life thus far on stage performing Shakespeare. Yep. Let alone the time spent thinking about him, talking about him, rehearsing him, and indeed writing about him. So I do know quite a bit about what an auto mechanic would call the snap-bang pop of the engine. But every so often in a performance I see a bespectacled 11-year-old or 12-year-old out there, and it doesn't half make me raise my game. Because I realize that everything I've learned over the years really doesn't add up to a row of beans unless I can do something very simple with it, which is just to pass on to him or her that same cocktail that so intoxicated me of sound and meaning and sheer physical impact.